After my grandfather's funeral, my dad inherited $450 million, and the first thing he did was look me in the eye and say, "You're useless now." Then he threw me out of the only home I'd ever known. 36 hours later, I sat in a lawyer's office and she laughed in my father's face. "Did you even read the will?" My dad went pale, because the will said everything he feared most. I'm about to share something close to my heart, but before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if my story touches you, please hit that subscribe button. It means more than you know because for so long, I felt invisible. My name is Evan Cole Walker, and this is how the truth finally set me free. The rain hadn't let up all afternoon. It clung to the stained glass windows of St. Andrew Church, streaking down in crooked lines that blurred the colors until the saints and angels looked like they were weeping. I sat in the back row clutching the folded program with my grandfather Harold's face printed on it, his smile calm, steady, as if he knew he would outlast all of this. The organ's low hum filled the vated ceiling, and in that cavernous hush, I told myself to stay composed, to say goodbye with dignity. But then, my father stood up. Martin Walker, the new heir, the man who had just been handed $450 million, stepped into the pulpit with that perfect smile of his teeth glinting under the dim light. He spoke of our family's legacy and giving back to the community. But not once did my name leave his lips. Not once. My chest tightened. I remembered Harold's hand on my shoulder years ago at the Boulder Art Market. His voice telling me, wealth only matters when it flows toward the vulnerable. My father's speech hollowed those words into mockery. When the service ended, the guests crowded him. Artists, entrepreneurs, and local philanthropists praising the new pillar of Boulder. I tried to thank the people who had admired Harold, but they orbited Martin now like moths circling a flame. The Walker mansion glowed that evening fire roaring in the hearth, guests sipping brandy, laughter bouncing against the carved walnut walls. It should have felt warm. Instead, I felt chilled. Martin stood in the center, a monarch basking in a coronation. Ruth, our old housekeeper, brushed past me quietly and whispered, "Mr. Harold locked certain things away in the library. Don't let them clear it out." Her warning lodged in my chest like a secret note slipped under a door. I slipped down the corridor to the library only to find the handle stiff newly locked. One of the staff shook his head. "Mr. Martin's orders." I placed my palm on the oak door anyway, silently promising my grandfather I would return the right way through proof and truth, not through desperation. When I turned, Martin was waiting for me. Gone was the polished smile. His eyes were steel. "Do you know why I didn't mention you today?" he asked. I searched for an answer, but he didn't wait. His voice cut clean. "Because you're useless, a dreamer, a burden." He leaned closer, the smell of his whiskey sharp. "By sunrise, I want you gone. Out of this house, out of my way." Something inside me cracked, but it wasn't collapse. It was the splintering of an old illusion. I carried a box of Harold's old finance books down the grand staircase, the carved banister gleaming in the firelight, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the rain lashed at the family crest, etched into the stone pillars. I held the one thing my father had given me, a heavy, expensive watch, staring at it like a cuff locked around my wrist. I started the car with the box beside me. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I glimpsed Harold's portrait in the stained glass. And for a fleeting second, I could have sworn he nodded. I pulled out of the gate's headlights, slicing the downpour, my chest burning with grief, humiliation, and a strange ember of defiance. 4 days later, the rain had stopped, but the air was still gray, as if the sky itself hadn't decided whether to mourn or move on. I stood inside a drafty loft apartment downtown, brick walls. Raw pipes exposed the smell of old timber seeping from the floorboards. It wasn't the mansion, but it was mine for now. I tore open the box of Harold's books, needing something to anchor me. That's when I noticed it. The spine of a hard cover called Value and Values looked oddly swollen. My pulse quickened. I slid it open, and a sealed envelope slid free, wax pressed with Harold's initials. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. His handwriting was shaky but clear. The will protects those who protect others. If you are cast aside, seek out Nora Chen. The right road will never leave you alone. For the first time since the funeral, I exhaled with relief. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had foreseen this. That night I took the watch from my father and listed it for sale. I watched the second hand sweep its last circle on my wrist before I set it down. No longer a gift, just a shackle traded for survival. The next morning I met Jordan at a small coffee shop tucked between galleries, the kind of place Harold used to frequent. We sat at a scarred wooden table, the espresso machine hissing like an old locomotive. I told him everything: the funeral, my father's words, the letter. He listened jaw tight, then asked, "Do you want revenge, or do you want to build something that lasts?" His question pressed deep. I realized Harold hadn't groomed me for vengeance, but for stewardship. I told Jordan my plan. Safeguard the letter, reach out to this lawyer, Nora Chen, and prepare to stand my ground even if Martin tried to smear me. Jordan nodded. Then don't fight him in the shadows. Build in the light. Boulder knows your grandfather's heart. That evening Ruth called. Her voice was hushed, almost drowned by static. Martin had locked the library, and Harold's office changed the locks entirely. He was preparing an inventory, but she had managed to scan some documents. "I'll send them," she said quickly. "And watch out for a contractor he trusts. He's lining something up." I thanked her, my throat tight, because she was risking everything by calling me. When the courier arrived later that night, I ripped open the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a will addendum in Harold's handwriting. One phrase stood out, circled in heavy ink. "The trust opens only when two push together. 2 keys, 2 signatures." I pressed my fingers to the page, my mind racing. Did that mean Martin couldn't touch the fortune without me? I pinned Harold's letter to the brick wall above my desk, beside the new document. I sketched 3 columns in black marker. Legal Nora, Public Community Project, the Cultural Center. My mission board, my vow. I switched off the light neon from the gallery outside, painting the wall with fractured colors. Tomorrow I would call Nora. Tomorrow I would find out what Harold had really set in motion. But as I lay down on the creaking bed, one thought refused to leave me. What exactly did 2 pushed together mean? And why did I have the sinking feeling that one of those 2 was my father? The glass walls of Nora Chen's office framed the mountains in a pale blue haze, their ridges sharp against the morning light. The place smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the kind of atmosphere that told you every word spoken here would carry weight. I sat across from her, my palms pressed against my knees to keep them from trembling. On the polished steel table lay a folder embossed with Harold's seal. Nora slid the papers toward me. "Your grandfather designed a dual signature clause," she explained, her voice even almost surgical. Every dollar from the $450 million fund for the St. Vrain Cultural Center requires 2 authorizations, yours and your father's. Neither one of you can move a cent alone." The words landed like iron in my chest. For a second I thought I had misheard, but the underlined clause was right there in front of me. Alongside it was something even more startling. If the 2 co-executors erupted into public conflict within the first 18 months, the fund would fracture automatically. Half would disperse to Boulder charities. Half would be wired directly to me. Martin would be cut out entirely. Before I could form a response, the screen on the table lit up. Martin's face appeared from the oak-paneled office back at the Walker estate. Behind him, a wall of whiskey bottles glimmered under low light. His tone was smooth as ever. "This is absurd," he said, though his jaw was tight. Nora's eyes didn't flicker. "Did you skip Section 8.1, Mr. Walker?" she asked, and then read aloud the trigger clause about public disputes. I watched my father's expression shift from smugness to something close to panic. He tried to sound commanding. "I will contest this in court," she leaned forward. "By filing, you create the very public dispute that strips you of control. The clause is self-executing. The moment the community hears of it, reporters will line up at your gates." I sat still, absorbing the symmetry of Harold's design. My grandfather had forced Martin into a corner, where the only way to win was to cooperate, and cooperation was the last thing my father knew how to do. Then Nora pointed out another section. "Note the timing. The successor had to present himself within 96 hours after the funeral. You barely made it, Evan. That was deliberate. Harold wanted to be sure you acted your own accord." The realization settled over me with a strange calm. Harold hadn't just left me instructions. He had tested whether I was willing to claim them. And I had. I picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement accepting my role as co-executive. The ink bled slightly into the paper, the stroke shaky but final. "Remember," Nora said, fixing me with a steady gaze. "This authority is not about ego. It exists to protect the people Harold cared about. Don't let anyone drag it into the mud." When the call ended, I stood to leave my mind heavy with the responsibility I had just assumed. That was when my phone buzzed. It was Ruth. Her voice was low, urgent. "Martin's already moving. He's contacting a contractor he's used before, the same one Harold marked as unreliable. He's building a maze of shell companies. Check the 3rd subsidiary on his list." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, staring at the Front Range mountains through the office glass. The battle had shifted. It was no longer just about law and inheritance. The fight was about the lifeblood of a project meant for the city, and it would play out on construction sites and boardrooms and across newspaper columns. I walked out clutching the thick folder, the sun breaking weakly through retreating clouds. I knew the next move was mine. 10 days later, my loft walls were covered in notes maps and highlighted documents. The neon glow from the gallery across the street painted the papers in restless colors. Every path I traced led back to the same name, Flatirons Construction Group. Harold had circled it in red years ago. Now Martin was pushing it to the front line. He arrived unannounced one evening, stepping into the loft as if he still owned every room I breathed in. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile polished at charity galas. "Blood is blood, Evan," he said, resting a hand on the back of my chair. "Why make this harder than it needs to be? Sign off on these contracts. I'll cover your living expenses. You won't have to lift a finger." I looked at him, at the suit tailored too perfectly, at the glint of control in his eyes. "I'm not here to be on your payroll," I answered. "Open the books. Make them public. Every contract, every line item." The smile froze. For the first time, I felt him measure me, not as a son to dominate, but as an obstacle to remove. 3 days later, we sat across from each other at his lawyer's office. The mahogany table gleamed, and on it lay the contract with Flatirons Construction Group. His attorney, a man with sharp glasses and sharper tone, pushed it toward me. "It's routine," he said. "You're young. You don't understand how deals get done." I scanned the numbers, the padded costs, the vague subcontracting clauses, the smell of varnished wood mixed with the scent of manipulation. I pushed the contract back. Independent audit. Every dollar accounted for. The attorney scoffed. "This is how you repay your father, by dragging his reputation through dirt." Just then my phone vibrated. An email from Ruth. Attached was a scan of Harold's own notes, his pen strokes slashing across the company's name not to be trusted. My pulse quickened. I printed the page and slid it across the table. "My grandfather warned me about this exact firm," I said. "He anticipated you, Martin." For once, my father had no ready words. The room stiffened. The attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ground shifting under his feet. But Martin's counterpunch came faster than I expected. The very next morning, the local paper carried an anonymous column. "Walker air sabotages community project for personal gain." The headline dripped poison. At a cafe, I heard whispers. At the grocery store, people stared longer than usual. He was weaponizing the public eye, painting me as selfish. I felt the walls closing in until Jordan stepped in. He posted an essay on his architecture blog. "Transparency is not obstruction. Evan Walker is safeguarding the standards this community deserves." The piece struck a chord, spreading among artists and small business owners. The tide at least partially began to shift. People started asking whether there was more behind the headlines. That night I drove past the construction site by the lake. Steel frames rose like ribs against the sky, cranes groaning under the weight of promise. I stood in the dirt listening to the clang of metal and the distant rush of the river, and told myself I had to hold the line. As I turned back toward my car, the phone rang again. A voice I didn't recognize. Low and deliberate whispered, "He won't stop at contracts or headlines. He's going to use dirtier methods to bring you down. Watch yourself." The call cut off. I stood there staring at the shadows stretching across the unfinished ground. The real battle hadn't even started yet. By the time a month had passed since the funeral, I had learned to keep my phone close and my answers sharper. Martin was no longer content with quiet maneuvers. He wanted to crush me under the weight of public opinion, and the first battleground was the City Hall of Boulder. The council chamber brimmed with reporters, community leaders, and curious citizens. Cameras perched on tripods pointed toward the podium where Martin stood, his silver hair glowing beneath the harsh lights. He smiled as if he owned the room. "Progress is delayed," he declared, his voice carrying across the wooden rafters. "And it is delayed because my son is fixated on power. The community suffers while he plays gatekeeper." I sat in the second row, my pulse hammering. Every head turned when I rose. The folder in my hand was worn from nights of rereading Harold's letter folded neatly at the front. "My grandfather wrote these words," I said, steadying my voice. "Protect others first. That is the principle guiding me. This project is not mine to exploit. It belongs to Boulder, and I will safeguard it with everything I have." A ripple spread through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. For the first time, Martin's certainty seemed to falter. But the attack was not just rhetorical. At the construction site by the lake, Jordan and I found shipments of glass panels stacked behind tarps. At first glance, they looked identical to the approved material, but the quality was inferior, brittle enough to crack in winter frost. The contractor had swapped them in cutting corners and pocketing the difference. Martin's signature was buried in the paperwork. We took the evidence straight to Nora. She moved quickly, filing an injunction that blocked the contract and replaced the supplier with a local firm that met Harold's standards. Within days, word spread through town that the Walker heir had stopped a dangerous shortcut. Wanting to build trust beyond documents, I organized a weekend workshop by the lakeside, inviting children to paint murals on temporary walls that would later line the community hall. The laughter of children mixing with the sound of brushes was louder than any headline Martin could buy. The local paper ran a piece titled, "Evan Walker Carries Harold's Torch." For the first time, strangers in coffee shops nodded at me with respect instead of suspicion. Martin appeared on site not long after. His shoes sank into the damp soil as he approached eyes hard as stone. "You think you've won a round," he said quietly, "but you've only just opened the war." I met his stare without lowering mine. It was the first time in my life I didn't flinch under his voice. That night, an official envelope arrived. The city council was instituting monthly oversight sessions for the project open to the press and public. Every argument, every signature, every misstep would be displayed under bright lights. I understood immediately what it meant. The fight had moved onto a stage Martin could no longer control alone. It would either expose him or destroy me. By November, the cultural center stood nearly complete, its glass facade catching the pale sun and reflecting the Front Range peaks. The air carried the bite of approaching winter. The final oversight session before the grand opening was scheduled at City Hall of Boulder. The chamber was packed, cameras, buzzing anticipation heavy in the air. Martin arrived in a tailored suit, carrying a folder as though it contained divine truth. When his turn came, he spread the papers across the desk. Evidence. He announced that my son has diverted funds from this project for personal gain. Gasps rolled through the room. Flashbulbs exploded. My throat tightened as I scanned the documents projected onto the screen. My name and signature stared back at me, authorizing wire transfers I had never seen. The floor seemed to shift beneath me. Then Nora rose calm, precise. She walked to the microphone. "These documents are fraudulent," she said. She held up the originals Harold had archived. "The signature is fabricated. Our analysis proves it." She placed the forged sheets beside the authentic records, the differences stark under the magnifier. The chamber erupted in voices. Some reporters leaned forward, eyes wide. Others whispered to one another. Martin's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. Cornered, he changed tactics. "I'm not here to fight my son," he said, his tone breaking into false humility. "I only want this center finished. He is the one who wants everything for himself." A murmur of uncertainty spread among the crowd. For a moment, doubt flickered in their eyes. Jordan stepped forward, carrying a set of samples. "If we're talking about integrity," he said, "then let us look at the glass." He placed 2 panels on the table. One of the substandard material Martin had tried to slip in, and one of the certified product we had secured. He held them to the light, explaining the risks the weaker glass posed to safety and cost. Reporters leaned in, snapping photos. Within hours, the story traveled. Evan Walker stopped sabotage of Cultural Center. Martin's composure finally cracked. His voice rose, echoing off the chamber walls. He pointed at me, shouting accusations, his anger spilling into the microphones. The very spectacle Harold had predicted unfolded in front of the community, public discord, undeniable, documented by every lens in the room. I sat frozen, heart pounding. but underneath the fear was a pulse of something steadier. For the first time, the imbalance was visible to everyone, not just me. When the council adjourned, their verdict was clear: the project would continue under strict supervision, and the record would show Martin's outburst for what it was. Outside, the press swarmed with questions, their attention divided but no longer tilted entirely against me. As I stepped into the cold November air, the courthouse clock chiming above me, I knew the next clash would not be in council chambers or legal filings. It would come at the grand opening under the glass and steel my grandfather envisioned, when light and shadow would finally confront each other without disguise. December arrived with a brittle blue sky that seemed made for glass and light. The St. Vrain Cultural Center gleamed in the winter sun, its wide windows catching every ray and throwing it back against the mountains. The plaza was packed, artists laying out their work on easel food stalls, curling smoke into the air, music spilling from fiddles and guitars. Boulder had turned out in full force. I waited behind the stage palms, damp, heart beating in a rhythm too fast. Harold's words surfaced in my mind like a hand on my shoulder. Wealth means nothing unless it lifts others. The mayor finished his introduction, and before I could take a step forward, Martin strode past me. He seized the microphone with a practiced flourish. This, he proclaimed, his voice booming as the legacy of the Walker family. Years of work, sacrifice, and vision brought us here today. Polite applause rolled across the crowd, but it lacked warmth. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching the tightness in people's faces, the unease behind their clapping. Martin was claiming what did not belong to him. Nora moved closer, a folder tucked under her arm. Her voice was low, sharp enough to cut. "If he keeps denying you, I'll read the clause aloud right now. He knows what that means." Martin glanced back, catching her eyes, and for the first time I saw something flicker across his expression. Fear, however brief. Still, he clung to the microphone. I stepped forward, not to wrestle the mic from his hand, but to speak beside him, my voice carried across the plaza. "We're not here today for a single name," I said. "We are here because of a shared vision. Harold taught me that wealth only matters when it flows toward the community. That is what stands before us now, something built not for possession, but for all." The applause that followed was not polite. It was full-throated, genuine rising from the heart of the crowd. Cameras snapped. Martin lowered the microphone, suddenly small in the space he had tried to dominate. When it came time for the ribbon cutting, I held the scissors with Jordan at one side and a line of children at the other, their paint-stained hands clutching the bright red strip. Martin remained in the front row, stiff and silent, his face pale with rage. As the ribbon fell, sunlight pierced through the glass walls and spilled across the plaza. It caught in the murals the children had painted spread across the stone like a blessing. The cheer rose, swallowing Martin's silence. I let him sit there invisible in the front row while I gave the spotlight back to Harold's name and to the people Harold had always believed in. That night, the papers carried a single headline: "Evan Walker, Guardian of the Walker Legacy." The opening passed into memory, but its echoes lingered in every conversation on the streets. Days later, Jordan's first exhibition filled the center. Light pulled over canvases painted by local artists. The scent of pine from wreaths along the windows mixing with the murmur of guests. Martin was nowhere to be seen. His name filled the newspapers, instead attached to words he had never wanted near him: forgery, sabotage, disgrace. The forged documents he had tried to wield were dissected in print. He still possessed his inheritance, but without the spotlight he had starved for. The community had turned away their judgment, final in its silence. The legal formalities concluded. Under Harold's will, I received 4 properties, the mountain lodge where I had once hidden from Martin storms, a downtown apartment, and the lakefront land on which the center stood. They were more than assets. They were anchors, proof that independence had finally become something solid under my feet. During the exhibition, a girl no older than 8 tugged at my sleeve. She handed me a drawing. Harold and me standing side by the lake with the glass building rising behind us. My throat closed. For a moment it was as if he were still here, watching, nodding. Later that evening, Ruth led me to a drawer inside the director's office. She placed a sealed envelope in my hands. Harold's handwriting stretched across the paper. If you are reading this, it means you have protected more people than your father ever could. That is the greatest victory I could ask of you. I read the words in silence. The noise of the exhibition muffled through the glass. Something within me coiled tight for months, maybe years, unraveled. The circle had closed. I stepped outside as the evening fell, the center glowing behind me. The lake mirrored the lights, a calm surface that seemed to hold both the past and the promise of tomorrow. Called useless, I whispered to the water. But uselessness opened a path to something real. Martin has his money. I have the legacy, and I have freedom. The anger still pulsed faintly, but I let it drift with the cold air no longer mine to carry. I left it with Martin, with his shadows. A child's laughter rang from inside the center. I looked back once, then walked down the stone path toward the lake's edge, the light catching on the water, guiding me forward. Justice had been done, but more than that, I was free, and freedom was the only inheritance I truly needed. A month had passed since the grand opening, and the town still carried the glow of that December day. The center by the lake had become more than glass and stone. It had become a heartbeat. I could feel it each time I stepped through the doors. Children's laughter echoed through the halls. Artists filled the walls with colors, and the community came alive in a way Harold had always envisioned. Yet in the background, like a shadow that refused to vanish, Martin lingered. He hadn't disappeared as I expected. Instead, he tried to claw his way back. I heard from reporters that he was making quiet visits to city officials, promising them donations, offering favors, hinting at new investments if they helped him push me aside. He wanted to reassert himself as the soul walker name tied to the center, the public face of a legacy he had already poisoned. At first, I ignored it. I wanted to believe silence would weaken him faster than confrontation. But then I received a call from a council member who had been approached. Martin had offered him money to push for a new committee that would rebrand the project, stripping my name and Harold's from the banners. It wasn't just pathetic, it was a direct insult to the memory of the man who had built all of this. Nora came to the loft that evening with a folder in her hands. "He forged letters again," she said, laying down the evidence. "He's desperate, but this time he went too far. There are officials willing to testify that he tried to bribe them." I sat at my desk, the weight of it pressing on my chest. I could take this to court, drag him into hearings, expose him until there was nothing left. Or I could let his schemes collapse on their own, leaving him to stew in the silence of his own undoing. For hours I wrestled with it. Every instinct screamed for me to finally cut him down. But then I remembered Harold's voice. Strength is not in how you strike back, but in what you protect. So I chose restraint. The newspapers didn't. Within a week, they ran headlines detailing Martin's attempted bribes. Photographs of him leaving the offices in anger. His face twisted appeared across the front pages. Editorials painted him as a man consumed by envy, clinging to relevance he no longer had. The community turned away. Even the contractors he once manipulated refused to answer his calls. One evening, walking along the St. Vrain, I saw him sitting alone at the dock. His shoulders hunched, his reflection broken in the black water. For a moment, he looked not like the tyrant who had tried to ruin me, but like a man defeated by his own hunger. I stopped a few paces away, the cold air stinging my lungs. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. He just sat there, surrounded by silence that weighed heavier than any courtroom sentence could have delivered. I walked on, leaving him to his own emptiness. For the first time, I felt no fear of him. He had gambled everything and lost the only currency he truly worshipped: attention. By spring, the center had become the heart of Boulder. Jordan organized the first major exhibition, bringing together painters, sculptors, musicians, and photographers from across the region. The halls glowed with light spilling from the glass panels, reflecting the mountains and the lake. The place no longer carried the tension of battles fought. It carried joy, discovery, and pride. I arrived early, walking through the gallery as artists pinned the last pieces. Children ran with brushes in their hands, leaving smudges of paint on their clothes. Volunteers prepared tables with food from local kitchens. There was music warming up outside. It felt alive, like the building itself breathed. At the entrance, a little girl tugged at my sleeve. She couldn't have been more than 7, her hands stained with paint. She held out a small sketchbook. On the first page was a simple drawing, Harold and me standing side by the lake, sunlight spreading across the water. Above it, in shaky letters, she had written, "Keep the light alive." My throat tightened. I knelt, thanked her, and tucked the sketchbook close to my chest. She ran back to join her friends, leaving me with the weight of something I hadn't expected. Proof that the legacy wasn't mine alone to carry anymore. It was already spreading, already alive in the next generation. Later that evening, Ruth found me in the director's office. She handed me an envelope she said had been discovered in Harold's old desk tucked behind a drawer. My hands trembled as I opened it. His handwriting sprawled across the page. "If you are reading this, then you have already done more than I ever hoped. You have protected people, not wealth. That is the victory our family needed. You will be tempted to hate your father forever. Let him carry that weight alone. You, my boy, are free." Tears blurred the ink as I folded the letter. I returned to the gallery where the crowd had gathered. Music filled the halls. Laughter rang and the windows glowed against the night. Jordan caught my eye and raised a glass. Nora smiled from across the room. The community moved as one, and for the first time I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. When the night wound down, I stepped outside to the terrace. The lake stretched before me, calm under the stars, reflecting the golden lights of the center. I took out my journal and wrote the final line. "Martin still has money, but I have a community that believes in me, and that is the one fortune that can never be stolen." I closed the book, breathing in the cool spring air. Behind me, the sound of voices and music lingered, proof that Harold's vision lived on. Ahead of me, the path curved along the lake, lit by lanterns placed by volunteers. I followed it slowly, each step carrying me further from the shadow of Martin's grasp and deeper into the light that would guide everything I built from here. I no longer carried the name Walker as a burden. I carried it as a promise. The journey you've just followed wasn't only about inheritance or the clash between father and son. It was about something deeper. The choice between repeating the darkness of those who came before us or breaking free to build something new. Evan Cole Walker discovered that true legacy isn't measured in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the lives touched, the voices empowered, and the community that rises stronger because of one person's decision to stand firm. Martin's hunger for control left him isolated, while Evan's willingness to protect rather than retaliate gave him the one wealth that cannot be stolen: trust, belonging, and freedom. The center by the lake became more than a building. It became a mirror of Harold's vision and a testament that light always finds a way to pierce through shadows. As you close this chapter with me, I invite you to think about your own story. What are you protecting? What legacy will you leave behind? Perhaps it isn't grand or public, but even the smallest act of truth, of courage, of kindness can ripple farther than we imagine. If this story moved you, if you found yourself in its echoes of struggle and renewal, then stay with us. Subscribe now, so you won't miss the next journey into the hidden corners of family betrayal and redemption. Each story brings a new chance to reflect, to heal, and to step closer to your own